Okay, so it looks like we are live on Facebook. So hello, everybody who is joining us either on the webinar specifically or on our Facebook Live for this information today that is a topic that we haven't covered before, but is something that Dr. G and I have talked about a little bit offline. So I'm Catherine Boyle from Key Ministry, and I am joined today by our fearless leader, Dr. Steve Grcevich. So a lot of times what we talk about has to do with specific, definitions of disabilities or specific conditions. But today we're going to talk about something that, you may have seen, but maybe not from this angle. And so really wanted to, spend some time kind of teasing out what this is, and what we're talking about today is twice exceptional or 2E children who have exceptional giftings and also disabilities. So a couple of notes before we get going. We are recording this. We are Facebook live streaming. So if you are a participant in the webinar, feel free to submit a question in the chat, and I'll work those into the conversation as we go through this next hour. And also, if you're watching on the Facebook Live, go ahead and do the same thing. And just give me a second because I am solo today, as Beth couldn't join us to help monitor either one of these chats. So thanks, Steve, for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us today.
Well, thanks for having me. You and Beth have done a wonderful job holding down the fort while I've been off running around for the last couple of years dealing with the mental health consequences of COVID and all the things that our kids have gone through.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, kudos to you for all that you do too. I mean, what a tremendous need in our culture right now, right? I mean, it's just kind of overwhelming in some ways.
It is overwhelming.
Yeah, I'm preaching to the choir right now. So yeah, I'm sure you know, but well, yeah, I don't even know when we first started talking about this concept of 2E or twice exceptional children. But it really is, it is something that parents and ministry leaders probably are seeing, but they may not know it in those terms. So, I have a definition here from a website that I'm happy to read, but I'd like to hear from your words, your own words, how you would define twice exceptional children.
So when I think about this, or when I talk about it in the context of my interactions with parents and families, I think about it as a kid, where there's clear evidence that they're gifted, but yet they have one or more disabilities for which they're going to need accommodations and supports.
Right. Okay. Excellent. Very succinct right there. But I think of this as being something that's pretty difficult to tease out. I mean, has that been your experience as well?
Not necessarily. So when we first started doing a lot of like the disability conferences and traveling around and interacting with other ministries, interacting with other leaders, this was probably like 2006, 2007, 2008. That there were lots of folks starting to get into sort of the whole notion of quote unquote special needs ministry at that time,
right? Particularly
around like serving kids on the autism spectrum. But one of the questions that I would ask folks is that, I had a kid that he was a kindergartner who came into my practice around that time, who I still see now that this particular kid's in college. And I would ask him, what would you do with a kid on the autism spectrum with 157 IQ? So that so much of like what we were doing, like special needs ministry, was set up for kids who had, what, we traditionally think of in terms of like, kids with autism spectrum disorders together with an intellectual disability or a severe communication deficit. With a kid with autism who taught himself Japanese at the age of 5.
Right. Clearly, the traditional disability ministry model is not going to help that kid.
Well, yeah, exactly. And and maybe, and this is something I think we're going to get into in maybe a little bit more detail, but one of the places where I think that, churches that use a very programmatic approach sometimes to ministry, want to be able to sort of categorize kids easily and sort of put them into a box. And
Right.
so a lot of the kids and a lot of the families that I work with in the context of my practice, folks who would be thought of, as having what we would call quote unquote hidden disabilities, don't fit into the box really well.
Right. Right. So, I've done a little homework to see what the numbers are on the number of kids that, are estimated to be 2E, twice exceptional kinds of kids. And so what it ends up being is basically about 6% of school age kids across the US receive some sort of supports for disabilities. And it's estimated that probably about 6% of those kids would be considered twice exceptional. So that works out to be about 425,000 kids across the US, which is not a lot when you think about the whole country. So, is this kind of, does this correspond to what you've seen in your practice too? Is it a pretty small subset of who you're seeing in your practice?
Okay, my practice probably skews differently than what a lot of other folks see, because I have a disproportionate number of, families where, their kids are, coming from pretty elite private schools, like the kinds of places you send your kid if you want them to go to the Ivy League or Stanford or Duke or Vanderbilt, like after they finish high school. They
Right.
tend to be pretty successful families with a lot of resources. And
Mhm.
so I would say that the percentage of kids that I see in my practice who sort of, fit this definition of twice exceptional is probably higher than what it is in the general population. But
Gotcha.
I would have a question about, like, the statistic that you got with regard to kids getting support, because we've done research before, like looking at, like, kids like here in Ohio, like around, like, when we were exploring, like, training grant for respite, like as a ministry, it's around 11 to 14% of the kids, in Ohio that qualify for special education services,
Interesting.
or getting like formal accommodations in school um,
Mhm.
related to a disability. And if we assume that maybe 5% of that number, so if you're looking at, like, sort of two standard deviations above the norm in terms
Right.
of how people would diagnose gifted, you're talking about like 5% of, like, maybe like, 10 to 15%. So it's
Mhm.
probably about double the number that you quoted.
Okay. Well, and just for everybody watching or either live or later, I got this information from davidsongifted.org. And this is a link that we'll share in the show notes. But they have great information about, what twice exceptional is. And, just some information like this about it's really hard to get a good estimate, but, what they think is their best projection. I think that was from 2019 data. So, yeah. So, one thing that, as I was reading through, and I think it was on this website, one thing that seems to be a strong characteristic of children who would be considered twice exceptional is what's called asynchronous development. So is that, you're nodding your head.
Yeah.
So tell our viewers what asynchronous development is in childhood development terms.
So when I talk to a parent, like, about, functional impairment related to a condition, some of the things that we're looking at is, we're looking at, like, intellectual development. Like, is a kid, performing academically at a level commensurate to, like, what we would expect, intelligence wise. But there's also, that there's also social development, like the ability to develop age appropriate social skills.
Right.
That there, you would think about, like motor skill development, coordination, like, one's capacity or one's, ability in terms of physical activities or sports, compared to their peers. And so, what we oftentimes find with a lot of kids who might be served in, like, gifted programs is that their intellectual development may be far ahead of their social skill development, and in some instances, significantly ahead, of, where they're at in terms of motor skill development.
Mhm.
So that, you can be functioning, you can be a first grader reading at a sixth grade level, but, struggling in recess and being the one who's the last kid picked for the team because maybe you're not, as good a soccer player, kickball player, basketball player as your peers.
Right. Or because your social skills are bad and you don't have very many friends in your class. And so that makes you less likely to be picked as well.
That's right. Or
Yeah.
or maybe you gravitate more toward adults because adults have more similar interests to what you have. And it's easy
Exactly.
to communicate with adults because you're interested in things that the other first graders aren't especially interested in.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, a lot of what we've described so far is very clearly many people who are on the high end of the autism spectrum.
Mhm.
So, in your practice or your experience, are there other diagnoses which tend to see the 2E kind of phenomenon going on
Oh,
other than
absolutely.
autism?
Yeah. So I was probably one of these kids when I was growing up. Um,
Hmm.
our younger daughter would be considered twice exceptional. That, like, Mira is scary smart,
Hmm.
but
Both your kids are.
uh, no, I mean, like, our younger one, like, both of them are really bright. Both of them were in gifted programming. But the younger one, who I would consider 2E, if you gave him an IQ test, would probably score higher than the physician at Mayo Clinic doing cancer research right now.
Hmm.
So she's really smart.
Hmm.
Um, but one of the things that they had found that she had in high school was something called a processing speed delay.
Hmm.
Which is, something we oftentimes see, like, very commonly in kids who maybe have, like, attention deficit problems, and either, like, a lot of obsessive thinking, anxiety, where basically, compared to her intelligence, it would take her about 4 times as long to complete an academic task as what you
Hmm.
would expect for another
Hmm.
kid her age. And what happens a lot of times with these kids is that they're so bright and they're so gifted that, that they can be getting, that they can be struggling significantly with a disability, but still relative to their peers, getting through life. And so where we saw this come out with our daughter was that, she was struggling early on in high school to be able to get her math test done on time.
Hmm.
And they weren't necessarily in a hurry to give her a lot of accommodations for that.
Right.
Um,
Right.
well, when she goes to take her ACT test in her junior year in high school and gets a 35 in English and a 6 in writing, after having gone to state, writing competitions, like when she was in middle school, that was like a big red flag for her, because again, she
Right.
got maybe 25 to 30% of the way through the writing test that they ask them to do, like on the ACT. And there was a stretch in high school where, again, she's in, all AP and gifted classes. It was taking her 4 hours a night to do the English assignment that it was taking everybody else an hour a night to do. And
Mm-hmm.
so she went through a stretch where she was probably averaging about 2 hours of sleep. And between what happened on her ACT and when she crashed the car into the garage door, leaving for school in the morning because she was so tired, at that point, we were able to get the school to intervene. Because
Hmm.
they're looking at her, and despite all this, she was top 15 in her class.
Right.
And they're
Right.
like, well, where's the problem? But, like,
Right.
when you
Right.
live with a kid who struggles with this on a day-to-day basis, you know, family clearly appreciates, the nature of the problem. The
Mhm.
kid's struggling, but again, it's oftentimes harder for them to get help
Mhm.
because as a result of their giftedness, they find other ways to be able to compensate for this.
Right. I just want to take a quick little pause here. Just a reminder, if you've joined us live on the webinar, if you jumped on the Zoom link, feel free to submit questions in the chat. I'm happy to work those in as we're able. And the same thing goes for the Facebook live stream. I am monitoring, so just be patient. I'm going solo here today. Beth isn't able to join us. So I think it's just so fascinating what you're saying, because kids who do have those kinds of struggles, it's like we've said with other kinds of hidden disabilities, they aren't necessarily trying to be upfront about what their challenges are. And so that makes it even harder for a parent, or even as the individual, because you don't want to talk about this thing that is an issue for you, because you probably feel like you can control it, or that it's just a character flaw, when some simple supports may be very helpful and appropriate in this kind of scenario. So what other you mentioned a few minutes ago that you think that you probably would have met the criteria for twice exceptional in your youth. Clearly, very, very smart person. So, what are some of the other, diagnoses where you see this kind of phenomena? You mentioned ADHD. We've talked about autism spectrum disorder. What other kind of diagnoses, where have you seen this?
Well, again, the keep in mind, so my population skewed,
right?
In the typically by the time kids get to me, they've oftentimes families have been to several psychologists or counselors, maybe other child psychiatrists. The ADHD thing is a big one, because basically, for kids with ADHD, there's two things that will get them, into, an office. One, and these would be the younger kids where they struggle so much with impulse control and self-control. They're getting into fights in the playground, they're in the principal's office all the time. They're, that they may be really aggressive. They get picked up pretty early on. The second thing that happens is if you have an attention problem and you start failing in school,
right?
Folks, that will get people's attention. But again, what will happen is that the kid who's gifted, who's in all AP classes, that they maybe maybe very disorganized, may have trouble following through on their homework, motivating themselves to study for tests. But they're getting C's and they're passing, and so that a lot of times, teachers, support staff at school would be more likely to overlook that type of thing. Right.
Yeah. And it can be very easy as a parent to just kind of get labeled as that parent with the pediatrician, I'm speaking for personal example here. We had a challenge with, like you're describing, with one of my children. And it was very clear that our pediatrician at the time, who we fired, just thought, I wasn't satisfied because my child wasn't getting all A's. And that was the farthest thing from the truth. That you're seeing something when you live with the child day in and day out. And so, it is a very frustrating thing. And I think it's because it is a complicated thing for families to tease out. It can lead to misdiagnoses many times.
Well, yeah, and there's another angle to this, which is, and I'm thinking about a family that I saw in the last couple of weeks where, mom's a physician or pediatrician, their daughter, again, it wasn't anything that would be a big red flag, but was concerned about the fact that her kid was, underachieving in school. And so if the school finds out that you've gotten a diagnosis, for example, for a kid, and this is particularly true with girls, because, the sex ratio in terms of ADHD diagnoses in kids is 3-to-1 male. In the largest adult study they ever did for looking at treatment of adult ADHD was 52-48 female. So that there are no sex-linked genes that I'm aware of that have been associated with ADHD. And so
just girls are better at masking,
quiet, better behaved. And so the kind of thing that parents are concerned about is, you're just a tiger mom. You want your kid to overachieve. You're looking for them to get some sort of an advantage compared to their peers, by getting a diagnosis. And so, that there's a certain amount of stigma, and in the culture certain negatives associated sometimes with parents just being an advocate for their kids and wanting them to be able to function up to their level of ability.
Right, right. And, that shouldn't be, because there are negative impacts on, not only academics, but the whole social, emotional, and ultimately spiritual component that goes along with not having, your deficits properly supported. I mean, in fact, one of the other resources that we'll link to is a website called SEN Gifted, which I think is supporting emotional something, or supporting emotional needs of gifted individuals. And it was founded by a professor at a university, I think in Michigan. He had a very bright, clearly gifted student. This was like 40 years ago. And that student committed suicide because, he had so little supports for, his social and emotional kinds of needs. And so, and clearly that young man was somebody who was, again, a twice exceptional kind of person, very gifted, but, probably on the autism spectrum based on the description. So, yeah, I mean, these are very significant things that, that we're talking about. And one thing that I thought was really good, again, we'll share the links in the show notes, but the Davidson Gifted website talks about how children who are twice exceptional really think and process information differently than their peers. And so, it can be difficult to find appropriate supports for them. And you've mentioned a couple times that, they can be underachievers or thought of as underachievers. It's easy to think of them as lazy or unmotivated. So what kinds of supports have you seen either, that schools have put in place, or maybe even that churches have put in place that really do come alongside these kinds of kids and help them in those kinds of environments?
So one of the things that you'll see sometimes is that, like, with some of these kids, like especially like the early grades in school, they'll oftentimes, like, it will oftentimes present, or the thing that will get people's attention is that they'll act out behaviorally because they're bored, that things aren't moving fast enough for them.
Right. Right.
And so, so one of the places where I see a lot of churches struggle, for example, is that there are places that are very rigid where, if your child is, 10 years old and in the 4th grade, they need to be with the other 4th graders. So
Right.
if you have a kid who's maybe bright, but, has some issues with social skills or issues with social anxiety, that they'd have no trouble going to church if they're allowed to go with, like, with their friend down the street who's 2 years older, or with a cousin or somebody like that. And
Right.
I've got a lot of families that, because churches maybe weren't particularly flexible in terms of thinking about those arrangements, well, the kid just stopped coming and the family just stopped coming.
Mhm.
Like, thinking about this in terms of sort of like, our family's experience, like our younger daughter, the one I talked about being twice exceptional, I don't think was ever involved in high school ministry, either in our own church or there's a church near my office, because we live 37 miles from the place we go to church. So that there was a place down the street from, like, where I worked, where, both of our kids volunteered and, we're children's ministry leaders. But for my daughter, like, she would say that I get a lot more out of, like, going to the adult worship service, and listening to the lead pastor teach than what she would get out of, like, what was being, communicated, to the other kids in, like, the teen worship. So again, like, the messages weren't, were pretty basic. It wasn't particularly challenging for her. She found the stuff that, like, she would get at the adult sermon a lot more, thought provoking. And, one of our family traditions when our girls still lived in the home was, Sunday night dinner conversation is, let's debate and discuss what we heard in the sermon today.
Yeah.
And so that, that particular, that kind of teaching, being a part of the adult stuff, even when she was 14 or 15 years old, for her was more impactful than anything that she was going to get, from
Right.
the school pastor to high school pastor.
Right. Yeah. I mean, obviously we talk a lot about within the key ministry world about, supporting children where they have weaknesses, understand that behavior is communication. It's telling you something about what's going on the inside of that child, even if they can't verbalize that. And so, these kinds of preferences, why not let a kid be in a class that is suitable for their interests and their academic, their interests, their ability to absorb the information and contribute, or, blah, blah, blah. It's really a way of playing to their strengths. And that seems to be a theme, within the whole Twice Exceptional universe, that is a good approach to take for kids who, maybe do, have, they're excellent in this way, but they're perhaps deficit in another way.
Mm-hmm. So one of the places, and this is, not to bash the church, because there are, obviously, like our ministry, we work with hundreds of, pastors and church leaders who are, very, competent, like, driven,
Right.
to make more disciples and to help people grow. But one of the things I think we are guilty of as a church as a whole, and this involves looking at all people, not just people who would qualify for Mensa or be, identified as being gifted, is that we do a really poor job in terms of helping people to recognize their gifts and talents and giving them meaningful opportunities to be able to use them.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And so, and so when you have people who, again, may have, exceptional strengths in one area or another, different types of insights, what are we doing to kind of help folks like that grow? And what are we doing to give them opportunities to be able to use their gifts and talents,
Mm-hmm.
to be able to honor God and advance the kingdom? Oftentimes, when churches are asking people to volunteer, I mean, there are things that we need. We need people to make cheesy potato casseroles, like when there's a special event. We need people to break up and set down, and store like tables and chairs and things like that. But when you have people who may be like exceptionally bright or exceptionally gifted, the young man I was telling you about with the 157 IQ, has actually won in middle school competitions where he was composing original classical music.
Wow.
Like, what would be the role for a kid like that, like in the music ministry? Could he be, could he be composing pieces, that could be part of a worship service? This kid, is a highly competent and capable pianist. Would you think about, again, like how you could use that particular gift, in worship services? But again, like a lot of times we don't think that way, when we think about, and that may be, and those may be some things that would be considered more natural abilities as opposed to spiritual gifts. But we struggle dealing with this issue with everybody, but with these kids, maybe where, again, you have this uneven development, or where they have an area that is a particular strength. All too often, we're not recognizing that and giving them opportunities to use that strength, to grow spiritually, and to use that strength, to be able to grow the church and serve other people.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we encourage outside the box thinking in our ministry all the time. And one way to really get a child or a teen, an adult plugged in, is to give them a real responsibility. And that's what you're talking about, is not just a make work kind of thing, but something where they can actually be a contributor, because you can tell the difference. I mean, especially a child that's that bright, they're going to know if, they're just being given busy work. So I think that's an excellent point. And, we're not just talking about autism spectrum disorder here, but clearly many people on the spectrum have very significant giftings, far beyond what the average person has. So, I mean, this is a, excellent case in point right here. I'm curious, was that young man with the 157 IQ, is he on the spectrum?
Yes.
Okay, no
He's on the
shock.
spectrum. This kid also he's part of what brought him to the practice is that he's also got fairly severe obsessive compulsive disorder.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But again, like extraordinarily gifted kid.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, are there some things, well, quickly, please submit a question. We've got about 30 more minutes to go. If you have a question, please submit it in the chat, either on the webinar or through the Facebook Live. We are monitoring both. So have you seen, or do you recommend either, something that is Ohio based or something that you've seen more generally just in your, being a psychiatrist, any particular kinds of approaches or, IEP strategies that are helpful for kids, on the spectrum or not, who would be considered twice exceptional children or teens?
Well, I mean, if they have like a specific diagnosis, for example, there are certain accommodations and supports that, are oftentimes like very beneficial. In that, if you got 140, 145 IQ but you've also got ADHD and you've also got like some relative executive functioning deficits. I have kids where this is sort of like the most rapidly increasing trend when I still had our group practice open, is more and more kids, especially high school and college age, were enlisting executive function coaches, to touch base with them several times a week to work on, time management, planning, organization, things like that. That there was a local school system, and I haven't seen this stuff from them in the last few years, but again, I think it's the second or third ranked school system in the state of Ohio, but where, they were having some hesitancy to putting some of these kids into the most advanced classes because they sort of added a specifier to this that not only needed to be gifted, but you had to be able to demonstrate that you had some of those higher level executive functioning skills, to be able to do it and to be able to keep up. And in a lot of ways, I thought that what they were doing was, terribly unfair to those kids, because again, if you meet criteria for having a specific disability, you're entitled to the accommodations that go along with that, under, Americans with Disability Act,
Right.
IDEA, which is like the federal
Right.
education law. And so, again, I think that part of what you need to do is that, we need to have them in environments where they're intellectually stimulated, where things are moving fast enough for them, where they find it engaging, they find it interesting, and then, if they have a disability that interferes with their capacity to do that, you provide them with the typical kinds of supports and accommodations that you would, someone who has that condition, but, again, doesn't have the giftedness that in some ways might help them to compensate for it. So an interesting place where this came into play was that when they changed like the diagnostic criteria in like the DSM-5 around learning disabilities. So that, for example, like prior to 2013, they would consider a learning disability like a condition where your achievement was more than 2 standard deviations below your ability, looking at standardized kind of testing. And so, so interestingly enough, like coming back to like our daughter, she would have been considered dyslexic as well prior to 2013. I mean, so that, her
Dyslexic, really?
Yeah. So that her reading ability is solidly, is solidly average when we went and had the whole battery of like psychoeducational tests done to get her accommodations. but you would expect that she would be 3 standard deviations above normal in terms of her reading based upon like her verbal intelligence.
Right.
So that the 2013 and below, like that would have been considered a learning disability. Now, because because her reading capacity is sort of within the average range, it's not considered a disability, even though it's a major discrepancy relative to how she is with her overall ability.
Mm-hmm. Right. Again,
that's
all
so that
asynchronous,
yeah.
asynchronous kinds of things.
Yeah, so that there were kids who would fall into this twice exceptional category who had special education supports, 2013 and earlier, where those were taken away after 2013 because of the way that they redefined, those specific learning disorders in the DSM-5.
Mm-hmm. Well, and regardless of what, the ability or disability, I mean, if there's a struggle there, as a parent, as a ministry leader, we want to support weaknesses. And so, if we're talking about something that impacts, for example, executive functioning, which is like the ability to plan and the ability to stay on task and that sort of thing, regardless of what a diagnosis is, you want to be able to support a student, or your child in a way that is going to help them. I mean, just because you have executive function deficits doesn't mean you have no executive function skills.
That's
but
right.
You can learn over time, that these kinds of things, this kind of planning, like you talked about meeting with somebody, a coach, a couple times a week, those kinds of things can help a person learn to stay on task. And so, that's all we're talking about. We're not talking about solving a problem, but maybe just, providing support and understanding and grace for students who do have, these kinds of challenges. So, blah, blah, blah. One thing that came to mind, I'm not aware personally, I mean, in all our conversations, I'm really not aware of how many students you have that perhaps are homeschooled, but it seems to me like this is a natural kind of, a natural area where homeschooling might actually be a helpful thing, because the homeschooled students I've known, a lot of them have had really exceptional gifts, and homeschooling allows them incredible flexibility to pursue those gifts in a way that a more, whether it's public or private, again, those are boxes, and they, pursuing their passion does not fit into either one of those boxes. So, any comments or thoughts on that?
I've seen that work in a number of situations. A lot of parents of kids like that are sometimes a little intimidated to do it, because like let's say you have a kid who's twice exceptional. Like, how many parents necessarily would feel like well equipped to like teach AP calculus to their 9th grader?
Right.
Or how many parents are equipped and resourced like to be able to like help these kids sort of like fully implement and pursue some of their interests. But I've seen this work like really well in situations where people put together co-ops. Where like it may be that mom or dad don't know how to do that, but the engineering professor who's part of the co-op might be able to teach certain subjects. I know that one of the for example, like and this isn't a homeschool thing, but one of the private schools in our area that's more elite, actually hired as one of their science teachers a research physician from the Cleveland Clinic who got rather burned out on, with some of the issues with medicine. But again, like, working together with like small groups of like really bright kids, that had been something that was very impactful and very effective.
Right.
So that in a homeschool situation, especially like if you can find like adult mentors for some of these kids, or folks who, may have some of like the specialized or sort of technical knowledge or background that the parents don't have, that can actually work out really well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's one thing that we have talked about a lot, and that we have included on our most recent resource, There's This Kid, is to have either special education teachers or grandparents, people who have a lot of life experience with a variety of kinds of disabilities, or just a lot of life experience in general, can really serve as excellent mentors or volunteers to support children in your ministry, whether it's your traditional ministry or it's your so-called special needs ministry, or if you're looking to support those kids who clearly don't fit into that disability ministry box, but they need a little something extra. Those kinds of folks can be really helpful to, coming alongside and taking more of a mentoring kind of approach, like you just said.
Yeah, so especially you're talking about kids where maybe their development is more uneven. One of the things that I see us wrestling with a lot in the church, and it may be something that we've been struggling with this generation kids, is the whole notion of discipleship. And how do we help kids to grow? How do we help them to be able to be prepared to defend their faith, in situations where what we teach about the value of life, sexuality is very countercultural. And I think that we struggle with that as a whole, looking at, the kids that we're dealing with in this generation. But this group in particular, that churches will have, or, when we go around and when we're, if we're training or consulting with, a church leadership around one of these issues, one of the questions that I ask when I'm meeting with the leadership team is, well, what's your church's discipleship strategy? And so, when we think about this with when you think about this, with a kid or a really bright teenager, again, intellectually, that they may be at the same place that a graduate student in seminary would be at in terms of how they understand scripture or theology. Their social skills may be more like a typical 5th or 6th grader.
Right.
And so, do we need to be thinking about the idea of having sort of discipleship plans for individual kids? Or
right.
Katie Weatherby, who a number of years ago was on staff with our ministry, talked about sort of a spiritual IEP.
Yeah, Standard Peoples too.
Yeah, and so are there ways of thinking about would a kid like that maybe be better sitting down at a coffee shop with a pastor and an elder and maybe 1 or 2 other real bright kids, doing sort of deep dives into topics that are of interest to them, related to scripture, as opposed to trying to pound the square peg in the round hole. They don't fit in to the high school group where everybody's throwing water balloons at one another and,
right.
and maybe gathered over, gathered at somebody's house where, that kid might struggle more in an unfamiliar social situation or with an unfamiliar group of peers to be able to engage. But because sometimes adults are more tolerant of those differences, one of the things that I almost hear invariably with these kids is that they relate better to adults than they do to their peers.
Right. Yep, absolutely. Yeah. So you mentioned, discipleship and really anything that is related to mental health, I think is really an opportunity for the church to deepen discipleship. And it should be viewed that way because if you have a challenge, and many of the challenges that we've talked about with these kids today are social kinds of issues. It's not that they aren't smart. It's that they, perhaps they aren't, at the same level developmentally as their same age peers. And that causes a host of issues, particularly in middle school and high school, in my opinion. And I think that I am right that 7th grade is the yuckiest year of life, basically for every human, but
especially girls.
It is really, middle school is such a challenging time. And, when you have a kid that has these kind of differences, it ends up being a very spiritual matter because you think it's, who am I? Why am I here? What has God done? What terrible mistake has he made in the way that he has made me? And so all of those things, church must not be afraid of. It is an opportunity to really help that person lean in and understand that they have been given perhaps a unique role in God's kingdom. And yes, it can be very difficult to have a unique role, but these people are original thinkers in many ways. And the church, our world, and in particular, our church needs people who don't necessarily think like other people. Doesn't mean that it doesn't mean, it just means that, God wired us all differently, and the body of Christ needs people who have 157 IQ, who can develop classical music, compose classical music when they're 10 years old, or, like your client. So
an example of this, I don't know how he tested out, but I would guess that like Lamar Hardwick would be like somebody who would fall in that
brilliant.
You got like 2 doctorates or like,
yes,
I don't know, like whatever else. And I mean, like, but his insights into disability and the whole like disability in the church book, I mean, for those of you who, follow our stuff, I think it's the most important book written on disability in the church in the last 10 years. Go read it, because, as a ministry leader and as a pastor with a disability, he has some really interesting, insights in terms of sort of understanding the notion of neurodiversity, and how folks who have these, issues really have been given unique gifts and talents that need to be, that Jesus intended, to use in terms of like building his church, and that, that oftentimes, that we brush aside, or we don't give people opportunities to be able to use those gifts or value those gifts.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, if we're seeing more of these challenges in the world at large, I mean, wouldn't the Lord be creating people who are inside of the church to address them? I mean, it's
one might think.
Yeah, one would think, his arm is not too short to address the challenges that we see in our time.
There's a notion in medicine that it takes one to know one, for example. And so that, like, when thinking about sort of like, people like in practice in our area, perhaps there's a reason why, someone such as myself who ended up being diagnosed with ADHD got involved in a lot of ADHD research and sees ADHD kids. And the neurologist in our area, best known for working with kids on the high end of the spectrum, is almost certainly on the high end of the spectrum himself. That what you are sometimes gives you some like unique insights into, not only like the struggles, but also some of the strengths that people, bring to the table, and, that kind of wisdom and that kind of understanding is something that, like, we're getting our butts kicked right now, and it's something that the church desperately needs.
Church must avail itself of the strengths of the people that, that God has placed in this generation. So, well, so we are going to share the links that we've discussed today, including the link to Lamar Hardwick's book, Disability in the Church. And if you have any questions beyond, our time here today, we are happy to answer anything that, that comes to mind later. I am famous for this. I'll think 10 minutes after we're done with this, oh gosh, I should have, talked about this particular topic with Steve. But so if you're like me, feel free to send me an email, Catherine@keyministry.org, and we will find answers and resources to your question. We do this sort of thing all the time. We provide free consulting for churches and ministry leaders, and if you're just a parent too, we're happy to take your question and route you to whatever resources are appropriate. So Steve, any final words before we go? Just, wisdom for parents or ministry leaders about supporting children who perhaps have some exceptional kinds of strengths and also some exceptional challenges.
I think that there are a lot of parallels to like what we try to do with sort of mental health ministry and our mental health ministry model. Like that this is a mindset in terms of like serving them and doing ministry alongside them as opposed to a program, and so that if you can understand like and be prepared to recognize where some of these folks may have like unique giftedness, and be able to support them through whatever things are involved that might be challenging or a potential barrier in terms of entering into engaging into church culture. That's how we need to think about it, so that, you know, that we're not asking people to create a program. We're asking them to understand, again, maybe some of the unique gifts that people have, recognize some of the challenges that they might have entering into culture, and remove the things that get in the way of them using their giftedness on behalf of the church.
Excellent, excellent. So again, mindset shift, changing your perspective, that can really work wonders with many people, not just the one, you know, twice exceptional kinds of kids that we've been talking about today. Well, thank you so much, Steve, for your time today. Thank you, those of you who were able to join us today. We appreciate your supportive Key ministry. For the Key team, Dr. Grcevich, and I'm Catherine Boyle. Thanks, and we'll see you again soon.
Thanks, guys.
Mhm.